In the shadowed corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace, where centuries of royal bloodline had ruled the kingdom of Eldermore, a single decision would shatter everything. Queen Consort Isabella had weathered political storms, public scandals, and family betrayals, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when King Edmund would be forced to choose between his crown and his heart. As the ancient clock tower chimed midnight, the fate of a thousand-year dynasty hung by the thinnest of threads, and the woman who had fought so hard to belong was about to discover that some battles can only end in devastating loss. The autumn rain pelted against the towering windows of Raven's Hollow Palace as Queen Consort Isabella Victoria Ashworth stood motionless in the blue drawing room, her fingers trembling around the crystal goblet of wine she hadn't touched in over an hour. The ornate chamber, with its gilded furniture and priceless tapestries depicting ancient battles, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed to whisper secrets. Every creak of the old wooden floors echoed with the weight of decisions that would soon reshape the very foundation of the kingdom of Eldermore. Isabella had always known that marrying into royalty meant sacrificing pieces of herself, but she never imagined it would come to this. The woman who had once been a celebrated ambassador's daughter, fluent in 7 languages and holder of 2 doctoral degrees, now found herself reduced to a pawn in a game far more dangerous than any diplomatic negotiation she had ever navigated. The heavy oak doors burst open without warning, causing Isabella to startle and nearly drop her goblet. King Edmund Alexander Ravenshollow entered with the bearing of a man carrying the weight of nations on his shoulders. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his dark hair tousled, his royal blue jacket wrinkled, and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. At 45, Edmund still possessed the commanding presence that had made him one of the most respected monarchs in Europe, but tonight he looked every bit his age and more. "The council has made their decision," Edmund announced without preamble, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't meet Isabella's eyes as he spoke, instead focusing on the rain-streaked windows that overlooked the palace gardens where they had shared their first dance 7 years ago. Isabella set down her goblet with deliberate care, her diplomatic training kicking in even as her heart began to race. "And what decision is that, Your Majesty?" The formal address felt like ice on her tongue, a barrier she erected when the emotional stakes became too high to bear. Edmund finally turned to face her, and Isabella saw something in his storm-gray eyes that made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger or disappointment, it was resignation. The look of a man who had already accepted defeat before the battle had truly begun. "They want you gone, Isabella. Completely. Not just from public duties or ceremonial functions. They want our marriage annulled, our union erased from official records, and you exiled from Eldermore soil permanently." Each word fell like a hammer blow, and Isabella watched as Edmund's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the only outward sign of the internal storm raging within him. The room seemed to spin slightly as Isabella processed this information. She had expected political maneuvering, perhaps a reduction in her public role, maybe even a forced separation. But complete erasure? The annulment of their marriage as if it had never existed? The exile that would strip her of not just her title, but her home, her identity, everything she had built over the past 7 years? On what grounds? She managed to ask, her voice steadier than she felt. Years of diplomatic training had taught her to remain composed even when her world was crumbling around her. Edmund began pacing the length of the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. "The Northridge incident, the leaked correspondence with the Valdorian ambassador, your comments about the mining legislation, your support for the workers' strike in Millhaven. They've built a case that you've been deliberately undermining royal policy and acting as a foreign agent." Isabella felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "Foreign agent? Edmund, you know better than anyone that I've done nothing but serve this kingdom faithfully. Every action I took was discussed with you beforehand. Every decision was made with Eldermore's best interests at heart." "I know that," Edmund said quietly, finally, stopping his pacing to stand before the massive marble fireplace where portraits of his ancestors gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to judge every word. "But perception has become reality in this case. The press has turned the public against you. Parliament is threatening to withdraw support for the crown, and 3 of the neighboring kingdoms have expressed concerns about your continued influence." The pieces began falling into place in Isabella's sharp mind. This wasn't about her actions at all. This was about power, control, and the age-old struggle between progressive ideals and traditional authority. She had been too effective, too vocal, too willing to challenge the status quo that kept certain people wealthy and others struggling. So you're just going to let them destroy me? Isabella's voice remained controlled, but Edmund could hear the hurt underneath the diplomatic tone. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of serving your kingdom, and you're going to stand by while they erase me completely? Edmund's face contorted with anguish as he turned away from the fireplace. Isabella, you don't understand the impossible position I'm in. If I refuse their demands, Parliament will vote to abolish the monarchy entirely. 1,000 years of Raven's Hollow rule would end with me. The economic agreements with our allies would crumble, trade routes would be disrupted, and Eldermore could face complete isolation. And if you agree to their demands? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Isabella watched her husband's reflection in the rain-streaked window, seeing a man torn between duty and love, between the weight of history and the desires of his heart. She had always known this day might come, the day when being queen consort wouldn't be enough to protect her from the machinations of those who saw her as a threat to their carefully maintained order. There's more, Edmund said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. They want me to remarry within 2 years. A strategic alliance with either Princess Evangeline of Astoria or Lady Catherine Pemberton. Someone with unquestionable bloodlines and political connections that would strengthen Eldermore's position. Isabella felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. Not just exile, not just annulment, but complete replacement. As if she had been nothing more than a temporary occupant of a throne that belonged to someone else entirely. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each toll marking another moment closer to a decision that would reshape both their lives forever. Outside, the storm was intensifying, lightning illuminating the palace grounds in stark, dramatic flashes that seemed to mirror the chaos within the drawing room's walls. How long do I have? Isabella asked, surprising herself with the practical nature of the question. But survival instincts were kicking in now, the same instincts that had helped her navigate hostile negotiations and political minefields throughout her career. The formal announcement will be made tomorrow morning. You'll have 48 hours to gather your personal belongings and make arrangements for your departure. All official assets, jewelry, properties, accounts, will revert to the crown. Isabella nodded slowly, her mind already beginning to formulate plans. She thought of her private study filled with years of correspondence and diplomatic documents, her personal library collected from around the world, the small garden sanctuary she had created behind the East Wing, where she grew herbs and flowers from her homeland. All of it would be left behind, erased as if it had never existed. And what of our private moments, Edmund? She asked, finally, allowing a note of vulnerability to creep into her voice. Will those be erased as well? The nights we spent talking until dawn about reforming education systems? The way you held me when I received news of my father's death? The plans we made for visiting the outer provinces to meet families affected by the flooding? Edmund's shoulders shook almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. Those moments belong to us, Isabella. No council decree can touch them. But everything else. He gestured helplessly around the opulent room that had been her home for 7 years. Everything else must be sacrificed for the greater good. The greater good. Isabella had heard that phrase so many times during her years as queen consort, usually preceding decisions that required her to give up something important for the sake of political stability. But this time, she was being asked to give up everything. Lightning flashed again outside, and in its brief, brilliant light, Isabella saw her reflection in the window glass, a woman who had tried to bridge worlds, to bring compassion and progress to ancient traditions, only to discover that some institutions were more interested in preservation than evolution. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing upon reserves of dignity that had carried her through countless state dinners, diplomatic crises, and public appearances where every word and gesture was scrutinized. If this was to be her ending in Eldermore, she would face it with the same grace that had defined her reign. Very well, she said quietly. I understand the situation. But I want you to know, Edmund, that I regret nothing. Every choice I made, every stand I took, was guided by love for you and for the people of this kingdom. If that makes me a threat to the established order, then perhaps the established order needs to be threatened. The clock's pendulum continued its relentless swing, marking time that was running out for both of them, as rain continued to assault the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow Palace. Dawn broke gray and merciless over Raven's Hollow Palace, its pale light filtering through the gossamer curtains of Isabella's private chambers like an unwelcome visitor. She had not slept, instead spending the hours before sunrise moving methodically through rooms that had been her sanctuary for 7 years, touching familiar objects, and committing every detail to memory. The ivory music box her grandmother had given her, the collection of rare orchids she had cultivated in the conservatory, the handwritten letters from children across the kingdom thanking her for her literacy programs. Each item told the story of a life that was about to be systematically erased. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Sinclair, entered quietly with a breakfast tray that neither woman expected to be touched. Margaret had served Isabella since her first day as queen consort, and her usually composed demeanor was cracking under the weight of the morning's significance. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the silver service, the gentle clink of porcelain the only sound breaking the heavy silence. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, then stopped herself, realizing the bitter irony of the title that would be stripped away within hours. "Isabella, I don't know what to say." Isabella turned from the window where she had been watching groundskeepers tend to gardens that would soon know a different mistress. "There's nothing to say, Margaret. Sometimes the currents of history are too strong for individual will to overcome. I should have remembered that lesson from my diplomatic training." The older woman's eyes filled with tears she was too professional to shed. "It's not right. What they're doing to you, what they're forcing His Majesty to do, it goes against everything this kingdom claims to stand for." A soft knock interrupted them, followed by the entrance of Lord Chancellor William Hartwell, a man whose political survival had depended on reading the wind direction correctly for over 2 decades. His expression was carefully neutral, but Isabella caught the slight tightness around his eyes that suggested even he was uncomfortable with the role he was being forced to play. "Your Majesty," he addressed Isabella with formal precision, "I've come to discuss the practical arrangements for your departure and to present the official documentation regarding the annulment proceedings." Isabella gestured toward the sitting area where she had hosted countless informal meetings with ministers, ambassadors, and citizens seeking royal assistance. How strange that her final official act as queen consort would be orchestrating her own disappearance. Lord Hartwell opened his leather portfolio with the efficiency of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. "The marriage annulment will be processed under the Ecclesiastical Dissolution Act of 1847. The Archbishop has agreed to expedite the proceedings based on the documentation we've prepared citing irreconcilable differences regarding matters of state." "Irreconcilable differences," Isabella repeated, tasting the legal euphemism like bitter medicine. "Is that what we're calling 7 years of marriage that threatened too many powerful interests?" The Lord Chancellor's discomfort was evident, but his voice remained steady. "Your Majesty, the legal framework requires specific language to ensure the proceedings are conducted properly and cannot be challenged in future courts." Isabella leaned back in her chair, studying the man who had once sought her advice on trade negotiations with the Eastern Coalition. "And my personal property? My correspondence? My research on rural education initiatives? All personal effects that were yours before marriage will be returned to you. Everything acquired during your time as queen consort, including any official correspondence, policy documents, or state gifts, must remain with the crown. Your personal research, if it can be clearly separated from official duties, may be reviewed on a case-by-case basis." The clinical nature of the discussion felt surreal to Isabella. They were dissecting her life with the same detached efficiency used to negotiate trade agreements or territorial boundaries. Every relationship, every memory, every contribution was being categorized and either preserved or discarded based on legal technicalities. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "What about the staff, Lord Chancellor?" Many of the household employees were hired specifically to serve Her Majesty's initiatives. The tutors for the children's programs, the coordinators for the agricultural development projects, the translators for the diplomatic correspondence. Lord Hartwell's pause was telling. Staff assignments will be reviewed and restructured as needed. Some positions may be eliminated if they're no longer relevant to royal operations. Isabella felt another stab of anguish. Her exile wouldn't just affect her. It would ripple outward to touch dozens of people whose livelihoods had become connected to her vision for a more engaged, compassionate monarchy. Teachers who had developed innovative programs for underserved communities, agricultural specialists who had worked tirelessly to improve crop yields in struggling regions, administrative staff who had made her initiatives function smoothly. All of them would now face uncertain futures. "I want to speak with them," Isabella said firmly. All of them. Before I leave. Your Majesty, I'm afraid that won't be possible. The announcement will be made this morning, and security protocols require. Security protocols? Isabella's diplomatic composure finally cracked, revealing the steel beneath her composed exterior. Lord Chancellor, I'm being exiled, not arrested for treason. These people have worked faithfully for years. They deserve to hear this news directly from me, not from some official memo distributed by palace bureaucrats. The tension in the room was palpable as the Lord Chancellor weighed his options. Isabella could see him calculating political risks, trying to determine if granting this request would somehow undermine the careful orchestration of her removal. Finally, he nodded curtly. 1 hour. In the Crimson Hall. But the conversation must be brief and focused only on professional transitions. No discussions of the circumstances leading to the dissolution. As Lord Hartwell departed to make arrangements, Isabella found herself alone with Margaret again. The loyal woman who had helped her navigate the complexities of royal etiquette, who had stayed late countless nights helping coordinate charitable initiatives, who had become more friend than employee over the years. Come with me, Isabella said suddenly. When I leave Eldermore, come with me. Margaret's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been hope. Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly. You can and you should. Your skills are extraordinary, Margaret. You speak 4 languages, you understand protocol better than most diplomats, and you know how to manage complex logistics under pressure. Whatever new life I'm going to build, I'll need someone I trust completely. The older woman's composed facade finally crumbled, and she covered her face with her hands. I've served the crown my entire adult life. This palace, this role, it's all I've ever known. Isabella crossed the room and took Margaret's hands in hers. Then, let's discover something new together. Let's build something that can't be taken away by political maneuvering or dynastic preservation. Let's create something that belongs entirely to us. Before Margaret could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. This time, it was King Edmund himself, looking haggard and wearing the same clothes from the night before. His appearance suggested he had spent the hours since their confrontation wrestling with demons that allowed no rest. Isabella, I need to tell you something before the announcement, he said without preamble. About Princess Evangeline of Astoria. Isabella felt her heart sink further, though she hadn't thought that was possible. What about her? Edmund's hands clenched at his sides as he spoke. The engagement was negotiated 6 months ago. The council has been planning this since the Northridge incident. Your exile wasn't a reaction to recent events. It was always the intended outcome. They've been building their case methodically, waiting for the right moment to present it as inevitable. The betrayal hit Isabella like a physical blow. 6 months. While she had been working tirelessly to implement agricultural reforms, while she had been visiting flood-damaged communities and coordinating relief efforts, while she had been sharing her bed and her dreams with Edmund, the machinery of her destruction had already been set in motion. You knew, she whispered, the words barely audible. For 6 months, you knew this was coming, and you said nothing. Edmund's face contorted with anguish. I thought I could prevent it. I thought if I could demonstrate your value to the kingdom, if I could show them how much good you were doing, they would reconsider. I was fighting for you, Isabella, even when I couldn't tell you about the battle. Fighting for me? Isabella's voice rose for the first time since the crisis began. You were fighting for me by allowing them to orchestrate a marriage contract with another woman? By letting them build their case against me while I continued to trust you completely? I had to appear compliant while I worked behind the scenes. Any sign of resistance would have accelerated their timeline. Isabella stared at the man she had loved, the man she had believed was her partner in building a better future for Eldermore. How long have you known about Princess Evangeline specifically? Edmund's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The initial discussions began 8 months ago. The formal negotiations started 6 months ago. The contract was signed 3 weeks ago, contingent on the successful resolution of our marriage. 3 weeks ago. Isabella remembered that time clearly. They had been preparing for the annual Harvest Festival, working together to plan events that would celebrate rural communities and showcase agricultural innovations. She remembered feeling particularly close to Edmund during those planning sessions, encouraged by his enthusiasm for her ideas and his commitment to making the festival meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. All while he carried a signed contract for another marriage in his pocket. Margaret, who had been silently witnessing this devastating revelation, moved closer to Isabella as if to offer physical support. The gesture wasn't lost on Edmund, who saw clearly where loyalty lay when political expediency collided with personal honor. "I want you to leave," Isabella said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of years of diplomatic command. "I want you to leave my chambers, and I don't want to see you again before my departure. Margaret will handle any remaining arrangements that require royal approval." Edmund took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Isabella, please. Let me explain the impossible position." "The impossible position?" Isabella's laugh was sharp as crystal. "The impossible position is being a woman who believed her husband when he said they were partners. The impossible position is discovering that your entire life has been a carefully managed deception. The impossible position is realizing that while you were making love to your wife, you were simultaneously planning her replacement." The raw pain in her voice cut through Edmund's defenses like a blade. For a moment, his composure cracked completely, and Isabella saw the man she had fallen in love with, vulnerable, conflicted, genuinely tortured by the choices he had made. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the mask of royal duty that had ultimately proven stronger than any personal commitment. "History will remember that I tried to protect both you and the crown," Edmund said stiffly, retreating into formal language as if it could shield him from the consequences of his actions. "History," Isabella replied, "will remember whatever story the victors choose to tell. And we both know I'm not among the victors." As the door closed behind Edmund, Isabella felt the last threads of her old life snapping one by one. In a few hours, she would address her staff for the final time. Then, she would pack the few possessions that legally belonged to her. Then, she would walk out of Raven's Hollow Palace forever, leaving behind not just a title or a role, but the naive belief that love could triumph over political necessity. Outside, the gray morning was giving way to a brighter sky, as if nature itself was preparing for a new chapter that Isabella could not yet imagine. The Crimson Hall had never felt more aptly named than in the moments before Isabella's final address to her staff. The deep red walls, adorned with portraits of previous queens and royal consorts, seemed to pulse with the gravity of what was about to unfold. Nearly 40 people had gathered, everyone from senior administrative coordinators to gardeners who had helped maintain her private conservatory. They stood in clusters, whispering among themselves, clearly aware that something momentous was happening but uncertain of the specifics. Isabella entered the hall with Margaret at her side, followed by Lord Chancellor Hartwell and 2 other royal officials whose presence added an ominous formality to the proceedings. She had chosen to wear her deep navy dress with the silver brooch that bore Eldermore's coat of arms, the same outfit she had worn for her first public address as Queen Consort 7 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. "Please, everyone, take a seat," Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the high-ceilinged chamber. The ornate chairs and benches filled quickly, but the atmosphere remained tense with anticipation. Isabella stood before them, drawing upon every lesson in public speaking and crisis communication she had ever learned. These people had trusted her, had believed in her vision, had worked tirelessly to implement programs that made real differences in citizens' lives. They deserved honesty, even if protocol demanded she package that honesty in diplomatic language. "I've asked you all here this morning because I have important news that will affect each of your positions and the future of our various initiatives," she began, keeping her tone steady and professional. "Due to irreconcilable differences regarding the direction of royal policy, my marriage to His Majesty will be dissolved, and my role as Queen Consort will end effective tomorrow." The reaction was immediate and profound. Several people gasped audibly. Others leaned forward in their chairs as if they hadn't heard correctly, and a few of the women pressed hands to their mouths in shock. Isabella could see minds racing as they processed not just the personal implications for their queen, but the professional ramifications for their own futures. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, who had coordinated the rural education initiatives, raised her hand tentatively. "Your Majesty, what will happen to the programs we've developed? The literacy projects in the mountain villages are just beginning to show real results." Isabella had expected this question and had prepared for the pain it would cause. "The fate of specific programs will be determined by His Majesty and the new administration. I hope that the value of the work we've done together will speak for itself, and that many initiatives will continue in some form." "But you won't be here to advocate for them," said Thomas Brennan, the agricultural specialist who had helped develop the drought-resistant farming techniques now being used in 3 provinces. His statement wasn't a question. It was a stark recognition of reality. "No," Isabella admitted. I won't be here to advocate for them. That responsibility will pass to others who may or may not share our vision for comprehensive social development. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Everyone in the room knew that Isabella's programs had often faced resistance from traditional court advisors who viewed social reform as a dangerous precedent. Without her protection and advocacy, many of the initiatives they had worked so hard to establish would likely be quietly dismantled. Sarah Mitchell, who had managed the Children's Literacy Mobile Library Program, spoke up with barely controlled emotion. Your Majesty, forgive my directness, but this feels like punishment for doing the right thing. Every program you've championed has helped people who had no other advocates. The mobile libraries have brought books to children in villages that had never seen educational resources before. The agricultural development projects have improved crop yields and reduced poverty in rural areas. How can anyone justify stopping this work? Isabella felt her own composure wavering as she looked at Sarah's passionate, confused face. This young woman had given up a promising career in urban education to join the royal staff specifically because she believed in Isabella's vision of using royal influence to address systemic inequalities. Now she was being forced to watch that vision crumble for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality or impact of their work. Sarah, sometimes political realities supersede practical benefits, Isabella said carefully, aware that Lord Hartwell was monitoring every word for any hint of criticism toward the official decision. Change is difficult in any large institution, and sometimes different approaches are needed to achieve stability. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with diplomatic language. Political realities? Your Majesty, we're talking about children who can read now because of your programs. We're talking about families who can feed themselves because of improved agricultural techniques. Those aren't political abstractions. They're real human beings whose lives have been improved. Isabella saw Lord Hartwell shift uncomfortably in his chair. The conversation was approaching territory that he considered potentially inflammatory. But Isabella also saw something else in the faces around her, a recognition that this moment represented something larger than her personal exile. It represented the eternal struggle between entrenched power structures and progressive change. What you say is absolutely true, Sarah, Isabella replied, allowing a note of warmth to enter her formal tone. And I want each of you to remember that the work we've done together has already changed lives in ways that can't be undone. Every child who learned to read through our programs carries that knowledge forward. Every family that improved their farming techniques will continue to benefit from those skills. Every connection we've made between rural communities and educational resources has created relationships that extend beyond any single administration. Dr. Whitman leaned forward in her chair. But what about ongoing funding? What about the teacher training programs we've scheduled for next quarter? What about the agricultural equipment we've ordered for spring planting? Lord Hartwell cleared his throat pointedly. Those operational details will be reviewed and addressed through appropriate channels in the coming weeks. Today's meeting is focused on transition arrangements. Isabella caught the warning in his tone, but pressed forward anyway. These people deserved more than bureaucratic deflection. Dr. Whitman, I encourage you to prepare comprehensive documentation of every program's current status, including detailed outcome metrics and cost-benefit analyses. Make sure that information is available to whoever assumes responsibility for these areas. Sometimes good data can speak louder than political preferences. Several staff members began taking notes, and Isabella realized they were treating her words as instructions for preserving their work despite the coming changes. The thought gave her a small measure of comfort. Even in defeat, she might be able to help them protect some of what they had built together. Thomas Brennan raised another difficult question. Your Majesty, what about our jobs? Will the new administration retain staff who were specifically hired to support your initiatives? This was the question Isabella had dreaded most. She looked at Lord Hartwell, who maintained his neutral expression but offered no guidance. She was navigating uncharted territory, trying to provide honest information without making commitments she couldn't keep. I can't make promises about specific employment decisions, she said carefully. But I can tell you that each of you has developed valuable skills and expertise that would be assets to any administration. Your experience with rural outreach, educational development, agricultural innovation, and community engagement, these are capabilities that serve any government, regardless of its specific priorities. Margaret, who had been silent throughout the meeting, stepped forward slightly. I want everyone in this room to know that Her Majesty fought tirelessly for every program, every initiative, every person we've been able to help. The work we've done together represents the very best of what public service can accomplish. Whatever happens next, we should all be proud of what we've achieved. Isabella felt a surge of gratitude toward Margaret, whose loyalty had never wavered despite the personal cost of remaining associated with a disgraced queen. The older woman's words seemed to give others permission to express emotions they had been holding back. "Your Majesty," said James Parker, who had coordinated the disaster relief efforts after last year's flooding, "I want you to know that working for you has been the most meaningful experience of my career. You showed us that royal duty could be about more than ceremony and tradition. It could be about making real differences in real people's lives." Similar expressions of support began emerging from around the room. People spoke about specific moments when Isabella's approach had helped them accomplish things they never thought possible within the constraints of royal protocol. They shared stories of communities transformed, families helped, and systems improved through the programs they had developed together. Lord Hartwell was clearly becoming uncomfortable with the emotional tenor of the gathering, but Isabella felt compelled to let her staff have their say. These people were losing not just a supervisor, but a collaborator who had validated their belief that government service could be a force for positive change. "I want each of you to remember this feeling," Isabella said as the testimonials began to wind down. "I want you to remember that you are capable of extraordinary things when you're working toward a purpose larger than yourselves. Whatever comes next, whether you stay here, move to other positions, or leave government service entirely, carry that knowledge with you." As the meeting drew to a close, Isabella realized that this moment had become something unexpected. What had begun as a formal notification of administrative changes had evolved into something more like a movement's final gathering. These people would scatter to different positions and different lives, but they would carry with them a shared understanding of what public service could accomplish when it was guided by compassion rather than just protocol. The clock in the corner chimed 10 times, marking the end of the allotted hour. Lord Hartwell stood, clearly ready to conclude the proceedings, but Isabella held up her hand for one final moment. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for believing in a better way. Thank you for working so hard to help people you'll never meet. Thank you for showing me that even in the most traditional institutions, transformation is possible when people of good will work together." As her staff filed out of the Crimson Hall, many pausing to shake her hand or offer quiet words of support, Isabella felt a complex mixture of grief and pride. She was losing everything she had built, but she was also witnessing the strength of the foundation she had helped create in the hearts and minds of people who would continue the work long after she was gone. The private study that had served as Isabella's sanctuary for 7 years felt different now, stripped of its governmental authority and transformed into merely a room where a woman was packing away pieces of her former life. Cardboard boxes lined the mahogany desk where she had once reviewed policy proposals and drafted correspondence with world leaders. The leather-bound journals that contained her thoughts on everything from agricultural reform to diplomatic strategy were being carefully wrapped and stored, their political relevance now reduced to personal memories. Margaret moved efficiently between the study and the bedroom, coordinating the complex logistics of separating 7 years of accumulated possessions into categories: personal property that could leave with Isabella, gifts from foreign dignitaries that belonged to the crown, and the gray areas that required Lord Hartwell's review. The process felt archaeological, as if they were excavating layers of a life that had ended abruptly and needed to be catalogued for historical purposes. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, holding up an ornate silver letter opener that bore the seal of the Valdorian embassy. "This was a gift during the trade negotiations. Does it fall under personal property or state assets?" Isabella looked up from the photo album she had been packing, images of community center openings, agricultural fair visits, and literacy program celebrations that documented her reign in a way that official portraits never could. "State assets. Everything related to diplomatic functions stays here." The arbitrary nature of these decisions would have been comical if the circumstances weren't so devastating. A book of poetry given by a village schoolmaster was personal property that could leave with her. A first-edition volume of political philosophy presented by the prime minister of a neighboring kingdom was a state asset that belonged to the crown. The distinction seemed to have less to do with intrinsic value than with the political implications of ownership. A soft knock interrupted their work, followed by the entrance of Princess Evangeline of Astoria herself. Isabella had seen her in official photographs, of course, but confronting her in person was a shock that no amount of diplomatic training could have prepared her for. Evangeline was breathtakingly beautiful in the classical sense. Golden hair perfectly arranged, porcelain skin without a flaw, and the kind of poise that came from a lifetime of knowing she would one day wear a crown. "Your Majesty," Evangeline said with a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and slightly condescending. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I thought it might be beneficial for us to speak privately before your departure." Isabella gestured toward the sitting area, though every instinct told her this conversation would be neither pleasant nor productive. Margaret discreetly withdrew to the bedroom, but left the connecting door open in case her presence became necessary. "I assume you've come to discuss transition arrangements," Isabella said, settling into the chair she had occupied countless times while hosting diplomatic visitors. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now receiving the woman who would replace her in what had been her private sanctuary. Evangeline took the opposite chair with elegant composure, arranging her cream-colored dress with practiced precision. "I've come to express my regret about the circumstances of your departure. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in the situation." The statement was clearly rehearsed, delivered with the kind of diplomatic polish that Isabella recognized from her own years of careful public speaking. But there was something underneath the formal language that suggested Evangeline was more complex than her political role might indicate. "That's very gracious of you, Princess," Isabella replied neutrally. "I'm sure the transition to your new role will proceed smoothly. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss with you." Evangeline leaned forward slightly, and, for the first time, her composed mask slipped to reveal something more genuine. "Your Majesty, I've studied your work extensively. The educational programs, the agricultural development initiatives, the diplomatic innovations, your approach to royal duty has been remarkable." Isabella felt a flicker of surprise. She had expected this conversation to be either awkwardly formal or subtly hostile, not a discussion of policy accomplishments. "I appreciate that, Princess Evangeline, but I'm sure you'll develop your own approach based on your experience and priorities." "That's just it," Evangeline said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that seemed at odds with her careful demeanor. "I don't want to develop a different approach. What you've built here, what you've proven is possible. It's exactly the kind of monarchy I believe Eldermore needs." The words hung in the air between them as Isabella tried to process this unexpected turn. The woman who was replacing her wanted to continue her work? The political marriage that was erasing Isabella's contributions was being contracted with someone who admired those contributions? "Princess, I'm not sure I understand," Isabella said carefully. "The council has made it clear that my approach to royal duty was incompatible with their vision for the monarchy's future." Evangeline's laugh was bitter and surprisingly unguarded. "The council negotiated my marriage to King Edmund precisely because they believe I can be controlled more easily than you were. They see me as young, malleable, and more concerned with ceremony than substance." They're in for quite a surprise. Isabella studied the younger woman with new interest. Beneath the perfect exterior, she was beginning to see signs of steel that reminded her of her own younger self. The ambassador's daughter who had entered royal marriage with idealistic goals and stubborn determination. "Princess, are you aware that speaking this way to me could be considered problematic by those same council members who orchestrated my exile?" "I'm aware," Evangeline replied firmly. "But I'm also aware that you're the only person who can help me understand how to make real change within the constraints of royal protocol. Everything I've read about your programs suggests you found ways to accomplish meaningful reform while working within traditional structures." Isabella felt a strange mixture of flattery and frustration. Here was validation that her work had been valuable and effective, coming from the very person whose marriage would erase her contribution from official history. It was like being praised by the monument that would be built over her grave. "What specifically do you want to know?" Isabella asked, finding herself genuinely curious about this unexpected conversation. Evangeline pulled out a small leather notebook, and Isabella realized this meeting had been planned far more carefully than the casual introduction had suggested. "I want to know how you built relationships with rural communities without alienating urban political supporters. I want to understand how you funded innovative programs within existing budget frameworks. I want to learn how you navigated resistance from traditionalist court advisors." For the next hour, Isabella found herself in the surreal position of training her own replacement. She explained how she had used her diplomatic background to identify shared interests between competing constituencies. She described the careful coalition building that had made controversial programs politically viable. She outlined the communication strategies that had helped frame progressive initiatives in language that traditionalists could accept. Evangeline took detailed notes and asked sophisticated questions that revealed both political intelligence and genuine commitment to social progress. Isabella began to understand why the council might have underestimated this woman. Her poise and beauty concealed a sharp mind and strong convictions that weren't immediately apparent in formal settings. "There's something else I want to discuss," Evangeline said as their impromptu tutorial began to wind down. "Your staff, the people who've been implementing your programs." Isabella tensed, wondering if this was where the conversation would turn adversarial. "What about them? I want to retain as many as possible. Dr. Whitman's educational expertise, Thomas Brennan's agricultural knowledge, Sarah Mitchell's community outreach skills. These people understand how to make progressive policies work in practice. Dismissing them would be politically motivated waste of valuable resources." The relief Isabella felt was profound and unexpected. She had been prepared to lose everything: her title, her role, her projects, and the team that had made her vision reality. But if Evangeline could protect her staff and continue their work, then perhaps her exile wouldn't result in complete destruction of everything she had built. "Princess, I'm grateful for your commitment to continuing these programs, but I need to warn you about the challenges you'll face," Isabella said seriously. "The council that orchestrated my removal will resist any attempt to maintain policies they see as overly progressive. You'll need to be extraordinarily strategic about how you frame your initiatives." Evangeline nodded thoughtfully. "I've been considering that. What if we position program continuation as efficiency rather than ideology? Demonstrated cost savings from preventive education versus remedial intervention, documented economic benefits of agricultural innovation, quantified diplomatic advantages of community engagement." Isabella felt a spark of something that might have been hope. This approach, emphasizing practical benefits rather than moral imperatives, was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that could protect progressive programs from political interference. "That could work," Isabella admitted, "especially if you can show measurable results quickly. The literacy programs have excellent outcome data, and the agricultural initiatives have already improved crop yields in measurable ways." As their conversation continued, Isabella realized something remarkable was happening. Instead of feeling replaced, she was beginning to feel like her work might actually survive and evolve under different leadership. Evangeline wasn't trying to erase Isabella's contributions. She was trying to build upon them. "Princess," Isabella said as their time together drew to a close, "may I offer you one piece of advice that has nothing to do with policy or politics?" Evangeline leaned forward attentively. "Please, don't let them change who you are at your core. The institution will constantly pressure you to conform, to prioritize tradition over innovation, to choose stability over progress. The moment you stop trusting your own moral compass is the moment you become merely a figurehead instead of a leader." The younger woman's eyes brightened with understanding and gratitude. "Is that what happened to you? Did you reach a point where you couldn't compromise anymore?" Isabella considered the question carefully. "I reached a point where I realized that being true to my principles was more important than keeping my position. That choice led to my exile, but it also preserved my integrity. You'll face similar moments, Princess. I hope you'll be ready for them." As Evangeline prepared to leave, she paused at the study door and turned back. "Your Majesty, I want you to know that history may forget your official role, but it won't forget your impact. The children who can read because of your programs, the families who prospered because of your agricultural initiatives, the communities that learned to advocate for themselves because of your example, they'll remember." After Evangeline's departure, Isabella sat in her stripped-down study and felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of completion rather than failure. Her work would continue under different leadership, her staff might be protected, and her vision for progressive monarchy might survive her own political destruction. It wasn't the ending she had imagined, but it might be better than the complete erasure she had feared. The dawn of Isabella's final day as queen consort broke with an almost mocking beauty, clear skies, gentle warmth, and the kind of golden light that made Raven's Hollow Palace look like something from a fairy tale rather than the political battleground it had become. She stood at the window of her chamber for the last time, watching groundskeepers tend to gardens that would soon be redesigned according to different tastes and priorities. Margaret bustled around the room with quiet efficiency, making final arrangements for their departure. True to her word, the loyal woman had chosen exile alongside her former queen, packing her own modest belongings into a single trunk that spoke of a lifetime of faithful service. Together, they had reduced 7 years of royal life to 6 carefully labeled boxes, and 2 personal suitcases, a devastating compression of what had once seemed like an expansive existence. The carriage will arrive at 10 o'clock, Margaret announced, checking the ornate clock that would remain behind with all the other symbols of royal authority. Lord Hartwell requests that you use the rear entrance to avoid any potential complications with staff or visiting officials. Isabella nodded absently, her attention focused on a small garden plot visible from her window where she had grown herbs from her homeland, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, and lavender for peace. Someone else would decide the fate of those plants now, just as someone else would occupy these rooms and make decisions that would affect thousands of lives. A soft knock interrupted her reverie, followed by Margaret's announcement. Your Majesty, His Majesty requests a private audience. Isabella felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped to avoid this final confrontation, to leave Eldermore without another painful conversation that would only add to the emotional devastation of the past 3 days. But royal protocol apparently demanded one last formal exchange between the husband and wife whose marriage was being erased from official history. King Edmund entered wearing his full ceremonial uniform, a pointed choice that emphasized his role as sovereign rather than spouse. The gold braiding and military decorations created a barrier of institutional authority that made him seem like a stranger rather than the man who had shared her bed and her dreams for 7 years. Isabella, he began formally, then stopped himself and spoke more quietly. I've come to give you this. He extended a small velvet box that she recognized immediately. Inside was her engagement ring, not the massive ceremonial piece she had worn for public occasions, but the simple sapphire band he had chosen personally during their courtship. The ring that had symbolized promises they had both believed would last forever. I can't take that, Isabella said, stepping back as if the ring might burn her fingers. It belongs to the crown now, like everything else. No, Edmund said firmly. This was mine before I became king, purchased with my personal funds, given from my heart rather than my position. It belongs to you, regardless of what happens to our marriage legally. The gesture was both deeply meaningful and profoundly painful. Accepting the ring would acknowledge the reality of their personal connection while also accepting the finality of its ending. Refusing it would be a clean break, but would also deny the genuine love that had existed between them before politics poisoned everything. Isabella took the box with trembling fingers and opened it to look at the ring that had once represented infinite possibility. The sapphire caught the morning light and threw blue sparkles against the velvet lining, beautiful, valuable, and completely useless to her new circumstances. Edmund, she said quietly, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry anymore about the political necessities that led to this moment. I understand that you believed you were protecting something larger than our personal happiness. But I am angry about the deception. I'm angry that you let me continue believing in our partnership while you were already planning its destruction. Edmund's composure cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion and guilt he had been carrying for months. Isabella, I was trying to protect you from knowledge that would have caused you pain without changing the outcome. If you had known about the negotiations with Princess Evangeline, what would you have done differently? I would have had time to prepare. I would have had the dignity of making informed choices rather than stumbling blindly toward a precipice I couldn't see. Isabella closed the ring box with a definitive snap. I would have been your partner instead of your victim. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably as both grappled with the weight of irrevocable choices and their consequences. Finally, Edmund spoke again, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite suppress. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? Isabella considered the question carefully, drawing upon reserves of wisdom earned through years of navigating complex international negotiations where personal feelings had to be separated from practical outcomes. Edmund, forgiveness isn't the issue. Understanding is. I understand why you made the choices you made, and I even understand why you thought deception was kinder than truth. But I also understand that those choices revealed something fundamental about how you view our relationship and my role in your life, which is that when crisis comes, you see me as someone to be protected rather than someone to be consulted. You see our marriage as something you manage rather than something we build together. That's not a character flaw, Edmund. It's how you were trained to think about power and responsibility. But it's also why our marriage was probably doomed from the moment I began challenging traditional approaches to royal duty. Edmund absorbed this assessment with the same careful attention he gave to diplomatic briefings. And what about love? Was that real? Or was I deluding myself about that as well? Isabella felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since this crisis began. The love was real, Edmund. But love alone isn't enough to bridge the gap between two fundamentally different visions of what marriage means and what power should accomplish. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression diplomatically neutral, but her presence a clear indication that departure time was approaching. Edmund straightened his shoulders and assumed the formal bearing that had carried him through countless difficult state occasions. "I want you to know that your work here made a difference," he said with official precision. "History will record your contributions accurately, regardless of the political circumstances surrounding your departure." Isabella understood this as both an apology and a promise, his way of saying that he would try to protect her legacy even while accepting her exile. It was a small consolation, but it mattered. "Take care of Evangeline," Isabella replied. "She's stronger and smarter than the council realizes. If you support her vision instead of trying to control it, she might accomplish even more than I did." Edmund's surprise was evident. "You've spoken with Princess Evangeline?" "Yesterday. She's committed to continuing the educational and agricultural programs, retaining experienced staff, and building upon the foundation we created. Your new marriage might be a political arrangement, but your new queen has the potential to be a genuine partner in progress." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Isabella was essentially giving Edmund advice about how to have a successful marriage with her replacement. But it felt important to end their relationship with hope rather than bitterness, with possibility rather than just loss. As Edmund prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the woman who had challenged him, inspired him, and ultimately proven incompatible with the demands of his position. "Isabella, if circumstances were different, we would be different people," she interrupted gently. "And we can't know whether different people would have been happy together. All we can know is that who we are and who we became together created something beautiful that couldn't survive the pressures placed upon it." After Edmund's departure, Isabella spent her final hour in private reflection, walking through rooms that had been her home and thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered royal marriage as an idealistic diplomat's daughter who believed love could conquer institutional resistance to change. She was leaving as a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest victory comes through strategic retreat rather than futile resistance. Margaret appeared with a final announcement. "Your Majesty, the carriage has arrived. It's time." Isabella took one last look around her chambers, gathered the small handbag that contained her most essential personal items, and walked toward the door that would take her away from everything she had known for the past 7 years. As their carriage rolled through the palace gates and onto the country road that would take them to the coast, Isabella felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For the first time in years, she was accountable only to herself. Her schedule belonged to her own choosing. Her words carried no diplomatic weight, and her future was entirely unwritten. "Where shall we go first, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked as the palace disappeared behind them. Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in days. "First, I think you should call me Isabella. We're not in the royal service anymore, Margaret. We're just two women with useful skills and hard-earned wisdom, ready to build something new." "And what shall we build?" Isabella looked out at the rolling countryside where she had once visited farming communities and seen firsthand the impact of good policy on real people's lives. Somewhere out there, children were reading books they had learned to love through her literacy programs. Families were prospering through agricultural techniques her initiatives had introduced. Communities were stronger because her reign had taught them to believe in their own power to create positive change. "We're going to build something that belongs entirely to us," Isabella said with growing confidence. "Something that can't be taken away by political maneuvering or dynastic necessity. We're going to build a life dedicated to the work we believe in, accountable only to the people we serve and the principles we hold." As their carriage carried them toward an uncertain but self-determined future, Isabella felt the weight of royal obligation lifting from her shoulders and being replaced by something lighter but no less significant: the responsibility of freedom and the challenge of creating meaning without institutional authority to define it for her. The road ahead was unmarked, but it was hers to travel.